of the Okinawa Prefecture DC Office. I'm very pleased to be here today. First, I would like to thank the George Washington University Okinawa Collection for hosting this webinar with us. I also want to thank all the distinguished panels participating in today's discussion. Dr. Hateruma of Seikei University in Tokyo, Dr. Mochizuki from the George Washington University for discussing U.S. military bases in Okinawa, and Dr. Robson for moderating the conversation. Our office was established in 2015 to facilitate discussion and to work with people in the United States to find creative solutions to the issues Okinawa faces today. We also promote understanding and culture exchange between Okinawa and the United States. So I'm very excited this webinar will be a great introduction to Okinawan issues and lead to more discussion. We, the Okinawa Prefectural Government, believes strongly that discussion is key to solving these issues. Through open and forthright conversations, we can develop new and creative ways to address Okinawa's challenges. Further, we believe that American people and everyone in audience today can and should be a part of this important conversation. I sincerely hope all of you will take this opportunity to reflect on base issues in Okinawa, and we welcome your questions and comments. We deeply appreciate your attendance this evening. Thank you very much, and back to you, Kristen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nakasato. We are honored that everybody is here to join us today for our webinar, U.S. Military Bases in Okinawa, Assets or Liabilities. This evening, we have two expert panelists and a wonderful moderator. Before turning it over to them, I would like to give a brief introduction to all of them. And they're so accomplished, I'm going to have to read from my notes, so please bear with me. First, we have Dr. Shino Hateruma, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, Seikei University in Tokyo. Her research interests are U.S. military presence overseas, base politics, and regional security of the Asia Pacific. She served as a researcher of the Regional Security Policy Division in the executive of the Office of the Governor for the Okinawa Prefectural Government between 2013 and 2015, engaged in research related to U.S. bases in Okinawa. And previously, she was a researcher at the Research Institute for Peace and Security, a Tokyo-based think tank. She participated in the Pacific Forum as a non-resident fellow supported by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and in 2014 was a Tomodachi Mitsui and Company Leadership Program participant. She received a PhD in International Studies at the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies, Waseda University, in 2022. Her recent publications in English include Defending NATO's Southern Flank, Spain's Democratization, the End of the Cold War and the U.S. Military Presence, and Exploring Base Politics, How Host Countries Shape the Network of U.S. Overseas Bases. Shinjin Kawana, the editors are Shinjin Kawana and Minori Takahashi. She also wrote Okinawa's Search for Autonomy and Tokyo's Commitment to the U.S. Japan alliance and the influence of the sub-state actors on national security using military bases to forge autonomy. She's also written several book chapters and newspaper columns in Japanese. Our next panelist, Dr. Mike Mochizuki, holds the Japan-U.S. Relations Chair in memory of Gaston Seeger at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. He is also a non-resident fellow of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Professor Mochizuki was Associate Dean for academic programs at the Elliott School from 2010 to 2014, and the director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies from 2001 to 2005, and he co-directs the Memory and Reconciliation in Asia Pacific project at the Seeger Center. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and co-director of the Center for Asia Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation. He received his PhD in political science from Harvard University. His recent books include Memory, Identity, and Commemorations of World War II, Anniversary Politics in Asia Pacific, Energy Security in Asia and Eurasia, Nuclear Debates in Asia, the Role of Geopolitics and Domestic Processes, and the Okinawa Question, Futenma, the U.S.-Japan Alliance, and Regional Security. And last but not least, allow me to introduce our moderator, Dr. Steve Rapson. Dr. Rapson is a professor emeritus of East Asian Studies at Brown University, and he also teaches at the University of Mary Washington. He has published books and articles about Okinawa and translations of Okinawan literature. His latest book, Keepers of Armageddon, Training and Deployment of America's Nuclear Cold Warriors in Asia, is a collection of accounts by veterans of the base in the context of nuclear weapons history. It describes 2 nuclear accidents in Okinawa causing soldiers' deaths and injuries, proposals to use nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War, and cancers associated with the radiation exposure suffered by base veterans. The book, Okinawa, 2 Post-War Novellas, includes the novella Cocktail Party, on which the film was loosely based, and other collections of translations are Southern Exposure, Modern Japanese Literature from Okinawa, co-edited by, with Michael Molaski, and Islands of Protest, Japanese Literature from Okinawa, co-edited with Devender Bhowmik. The Okinawa Diaspora in Japan, Crossing the Borders Within, is a history of the Okinawan migration to mainland Japan with interviews and written accounts of residents describing their experiences. Dr. Rapson was stationed as a U.S. Army draftee during 1967 and 68 at the base in Henoko, Okinawa, that stored nuclear weapons. Dr. Rapson, I now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kristen, for that very warm introduction. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hateruma to begin. So can you please tell us about your research, particularly what you've done on the Okinawa issues, and your thoughts on today's topic?
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. So let me share the screen. All right, do you see the title page?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me go on. So thank you for the kind introduction, Kristen, first. And I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to discuss U.S. bases in Okinawa. And the purpose of my presentation is to offer you my perspective of the situations in Okinawa regarding the continuous presence of U.S. forces. I also try to touch upon Okinawa's reaction to the reinforcement of Japanese self-defense forces on the islands too. Before beginning my presentation, let me again introduce myself very briefly. My academic background is IR, International Relations and International Security, and I gained a PhD degree half a year ago from Waseda University. The dissertation was on conditions on U.S. agreements of the closure of overseas bases, focusing on how the United States dealt with host countries' demands to return the bases. And I'm currently based in Tokyo, but I spend, excuse me, I spent childhood and teenage years in Okinawa. And I also had a work experience as a researcher within the Okinawa Prefecture government during the Governor Nakaima era. And I think it was a time when I first met Professor Mochizuki. So I'd like to thank him to invite me to this opportunity today, and also thank staffs of George Washington University and Okinawa Prefecture Government, Washington office. Excuse me. So here is the content of my brief presentation. First, I will quickly overview current security issues in Okinawa, mention some local responses to the reinforcement of U.S. and Japan defense capabilities. Second, I will introduce some opinion polls to show how the people of Okinawa, as well as mainland Japan, see the U.S. military presence. Lastly, I will bring some implications in relation to the rise of China. Here, I would like to point out that the communication between Tokyo and Okinawa has been deadlocked, which could create a situation where China takes advantage of wedging between the two. So let me begin with a quick overview of the current security issues regarding U.S. bases in Okinawa. I pick up 4 main issues, but I think Professor Mochizuki may explain U.S. and Japanese strategy in detail, so I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. But first, there is the Henoko problem, known as Futenma Relocation Program otherwise, the confrontation of the Japanese government and the Okinawa Prefecture government has existed over the construction of the Futenma Relocation Facility. The recent judgment made by the Japanese Supreme Court rejected an appeal by Okinawan governor. And second, the U.S. Marine Corps transformation. The Marine Corps is in the middle of a transformation into a more mobile, low signature expeditionary force. They are trying to establish small footprints all over the Western Pacific through increasing access and joint exercises with forces of the U.S. allies and partners. Not only Marine Corps, but also Air Force has shown the same tendency. Third, the Japanese self-defense forces, especially ground SDF, is strengthening its defense capabilities across the Ryukyu Islands. Fourth, there are issues and concerns over Taiwan contingencies, and Okinawa is too close to the potential theater. Local daily life, economic activities, lifelines, supply chain will be affected directly and significantly. There is also a potential issue of evacuation plans and shelters. So I just picked up a couple of examples of local protests against the expansion of both USFJ and SDF in Okinawa, happening only in this month. For example, Marine Corps resumed operations of Osprey after the critical accident in November 2023. Some local assemblies passed protest resolutions. There was a U.S. Navy warship port call at the civilian port in Ishigaki. And dock workers in Ishigaki port went on a 2-day strike in protest. There was also opposition to expanding SDF bases. The Ministry of Defense disclosed a plan to prepare ground SDF training area in Uruma City in the middle of Okinawa main island, but it faced the local protest. So I think one of the reasons behind these opposition movements is, I would say, not in my backyard anymore, not just NIMBY, not in my backyard anymore. So reinforcing defense by US and SDF seems an add up on a full basket. In the past decades, researches by Japanese young scholars have revealed the process of base concentration on Okinawa. Let me show 2 graphs. This graph shows how the number of US military personnel changed in mainland Japan and Okinawa respectively. In the 1950s, when there was the Korean War, the US forces were heavily deployed in mainland Japan. It was between 100,000 and 200,000 in mainland, while about 20,000 in Okinawa. During and after the Vietnam War, however, US personnel in Okinawa outnumbered that in mainland Japan. Another graph shows the ratio of area provided for USFJ in mainland Japan and Okinawa respectively. It is the same tendency. Before the 1960s, the majority of the bases were located in mainland, but after the 1970s, the ratio became reversal, and Okinawa has provided much more bases than any other prefectures. So the scholarly works on the history of US-Japan diplomacy have renewed the understanding of why Okinawa has borne the heavy US military presence. They argue it's not simply geographical or geopolitical reasons, but political reasons that shape the situation. As a main part of my presentation, I'm going to share some opinion polls on US bases conducted both in mainland Japan and Okinawa. my point here is there's not very big gap between Okinawa and the rest of Japan about the U.S. bases in general, but I will show you a notable gap between them in regards to U.S. bases in the worsening security environment surrounding Okinawa. I'm going to introduce 4 question results. First, how much does the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty contribute to Japan's peace and security? This was taken by NHK, the Japanese broadcasting company, in 2022 as a survey on 50-year revision of Okinawa. In mainland Japan, more than 80% of respondents think the security treaty is very helpful and helpful to some extent. In Okinawa, more than half of the respondents view the treaty positively. Another question by NHK goes, what do you want with the US base? The highest answers both in Okinawa and mainland Japan was US bases should be the same level with ones in mainland Japan. So it's not too much to say, not only the people of Okinawa, but also the people in the rest of Japan think the allocation of US bases is disproportionate and the situation of Okinawa should be improved. Another survey done by Okinawa Prefecture government conducted 2 years ago asked whether US bases are necessary in Okinawa. Approximately half of the respondents answered positively both mainland Japan and Okinawa. I'd like to gather your attention to Okinawa's results. People who agree is about 48%, while the people who disagree is about 43%. So this tells us that opposing views towards US bases in Okinawa are competing with each other. The OPG survey of 2022 further asked the question, the reasons for and against US bases in Okinawa. The top left graph shows reasons why the respondents regarded the bases as necessary. Bottom right is the graph of reasons why respondents considered the bases are unnecessary. So multiple responses were allowed, so the total does not add up to 100%. So let's look at the reasons for US presence. The largest answer both in Okinawa and mainland Japan was because deterrence and coping capabilities are necessary due to U.S. China tensions and confrontation. The second was because SDF capabilities are not enough. An interesting point is the third in Okinawa. Okinawa's response, more than 50% answered because of the fear of being attacked by China. This answer was only 36% in mainland Japan. So let's move on to the reasons against US bases. Here, I'd like to point out that the highest answers was because of the risk of Japan being drawn into a war due to the presence of the bases. In concluding the second part, I wanted to draw some highlights from these survey results. It can be said that there is a general understanding among the Japanese, including the people in Okinawa, that US-Japan security arrangements are necessary for peace and security of Japan. And also, there's understanding that the burden of US forces in Japan is disproportionately shouldered by Okinawa. However, as far as I observe, there is no nationwide or the national level movements or consensus that supports Okinawa. In contrast, there has been a tendency called Okinawa bashing or Okinawa hate, especially in SNS dimension. In terms of the influence of increasing Chinese assertiveness on Okinawan's people's perception of US bases, I can say that it does not necessarily lead to Okinawa's full cooperation in US-Japan alliance. So let me put it in a different way. US military presence is a double-edged sword. In alliance politics, an ally may have dilemma between the fear of entrapment and the fear of abandonment. As Japan has enhanced the security cooperation with the United States, Japan does not seem to have the fear of entrapment by continuing hosting US bases in Okinawa. From a strategic and military aspect, deploying forces near the borders or potential theater that could function as a deterrence or tripwire, but it could be a provocation against enemies. So in the eyes of the people living in Okinawa, though, U.S. military presence in their neighborhood can be deterrence or protection, while there is a fear that Okinawa could become a victim by association due to the presence of U.S. bases. which makes Okinawa more likely to be attacked if a conflict arose. So as the last part of my presentation, I'd like to draw some implications of U.S. bases in Okinawa in time of heightened tensions. So let me clarify the situations of both Okinawa and Tokyo, or GOJ, Government of Japan, or mainland Japan. First, Okinawa has accumulated discontent and distrust over US bases, and discontent with how the government of Japan handles the issue. Also, there are reasonable concerns that Okinawa will suffer in every aspect from should Taiwan conflict occur. Second, the Japanese government prioritized national security over meeting Okinawa's demands. In terms of the Henoko relocation issue, changing the current plan takes huge political costs. Especially, it was apparent in the failure of Democratic Party of Japan administration in 2009. In addition, benefits of changing the plans don't seem to be big from the government's perspective. So the Japanese government seems reluctant to discuss the issue with Okinawa any longer, while the Governor Tamaki has been eager to talk. At the moment, there seems no occasion or even communication pipe for Tokyo and Naha to discuss or review the relocation plan. But if you leave the crack between Tokyo and Naha unfilled, as it is now, it may generate a risk of China's wedging between the two. If the burden of the security policy continues to increase without solving the underlying problems, dissatisfaction among the people of Okinawa will accumulate rather than dissipate. So thank you so much. That's all for my presentation. I'm looking for the further discussion. Thank you.
Hi, Steve, I think you're muted.
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I want to thank Dr. Hateruma for that most informative presentation, and we look forward very much to discussing the issues that she's raised in this webinar. Now it's time to turn to Dr. Mochizuki for his presentation, which we can look forward to. Mike?
Thank you very much. as a way of self-introduction, I first started examining the U.S. military base issue in Okinawa back in 1995, soon after the horrible gang rape of a young Okinawan girl by 3 U.S. Servicemen, which provoked one of the deepest crises in U.S.-Japan relations. And in that context, I examined with my colleague at Brookings Institution, Michael O'Hanlon, the role of the U.S. military presence in Okinawa. And I ended up staking out a very unorthodox position. I found that in the discussions about the U.S. military presence in Okinawa, there were basically 2 schools of thought. One school of thought were those that put great emphasis on the strategic importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance, and they wanted to maintain the status quo of the U.S. military presence. And then on the other side were those that wanted a dramatic reduction of U.S. military forces in Okinawa, and they tended to be not in favor of the U.S.-Japan alliance. But my position was kind of somewhat paradoxically that the best way to reduce the U.S. military presence in Okinawa is through a strengthening of the U.S.-Japan security alliance. And so I firmly believe that the U.S.-Japan security alliance has become stronger since 1995, and there is really an opportunity to fundamentally transform the U.S. military presence in Okinawa. Now, back in the 1990s, when Michael O'Hanlon and I argued that the U.S. Marine Corps presence could be drastically reduced, we got quite a bit of pushback from the U.S. policy community. And the argument that they made was that these forces and these bases in Okinawa were important, vital for a U.S. military response to possible North Korean aggression in the Korean Peninsula. But we countered that argument by stating that the location of Okinawa was in fact too distant, and the United States did not have the strategic air or sea left to take the infantry troops from Okinawa to the Korean Peninsula rapidly. And in fact, a better staging area might be facilities on Kyushu or even in South Korea. And so we proposed that there should be the pre-positioning of equipment in Kyushu or in South Korea, and Marine Corps troops could be flown in from the continent of the United States. Now, today, people don't talk too much about the role of U.S. forces in Okinawa for Korean contingency. The focus is now on a contingency related to Taiwan and the threat that China poses to U.S. and Japanese interests. And this has changed the outlook of the U.S. Military. And as Dr. Hateruma mentioned, both the U.S. Air Force that has the Kudene Air Force Base in Okinawa and the U.S. Marine Corps has undergone an internal review to develop a new military doctrine and new operational plans and new posture. The U.S. Air Force understands that its presence in Okinawa is highly vulnerable to Chinese missile attacks. And in response to that, the U.S. Air Force has come up with this notion called the Agile Combat Employment, or DOD, the military likes acronyms, so they call it ACE. And the idea here is to harden air bases, including that in Kadena in Okinawa, to increase the resilience of these air bases after an attack, but also to develop plans for the rapid dispersal of aircraft deployed in Okinawa at the beginning of a crisis so that they would be less vulnerable to attack. And so one of the major challenges is how to move aircraft rapidly and to where. The other U.S. air bases in Japan, self-defense force bases, or even possibly Japanese civilian facilities. But the idea is not only to survive, but to be close enough so that after the first salvo of Chinese missiles, the U.S. air power can reinsert itself into the theater of conflict and engage the adversary, which is China. So that's the U.S. Air Force idea, the new doctrine called ACE. The U.S. Marine Corps has developed what they call Force Design 2030. And there are two key concepts in Force Design 2030. And they also have acronyms. One is called LOS, which stands for Literal Operations in a Contested Environment. And the other is EBO, Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations. Now, what this means, to a layperson is basically to distribute rapidly small units in contested areas, such as remote islands in the conflict theater of a Taiwan Strait. So these could be remote islands in the Taiwan Strait, in Japan's Southwest Island chain, which would be Okinawa, or even the Philippines. And rather than dispersing like the U.S. Air Force to ensure the survival of aircraft, the U.S. Marine Corps in small kind of mobile units, as Dr. Hateruma says, would go into harm's way to serve as a stand-in force for distributed operations. And to do this, the Marine Corps has now been reorganizing itself away from the standard Marine regiment to what they call the Marine Littoral Regiment. And they've already established the 3rd Marine Littoral Regiment in Hawaii. They've recently announced the formation of the 12th Marine Littoral Regiment in Okinawa, and there are plans to create a 3rd Marine Littoral Regiment for possible deployment in Guam. And the core of this force is likely to be the Marines, some of the Marines that are deployed in Okinawa. Now, this is still a work in progress. We still don't know exactly what this means for the U.S. Marine Corps presence in Okinawa. It raises questions about how many transport aircraft is necessary to be permanently deployed in Okinawa. Right now, there are 24 MV-22 Osprey aircraft that are deployed in Futenma. But these aircraft could be highly vulnerable to Chinese attacks. There are also a number of questions about whether these operations by Marine units, and they would be very brave to go into these contested environments, but how much would they really contribute to a successful military operation against China to deny China's war aims in the Taiwan contingency? A number of retired U.S. Marine Corps top brass have even criticized Force Design 2030. And as a result of this, Congress has mandated a formal review of Force Design 2030 in the recent National Defense Authorization Act. And so this is a work in progress, and there may be revisions. But in the meantime, the key issue for Okinawa right now is the Futenma Replacement Facility. And although Tokyo has won the legal battle in moving ahead with the Futenma Replacement Facility, it is still likely to take almost 9 to 10 years to complete, maybe even longer. And the big question is what to do in the meantime. Would Futenma continue to be used? Recently, the military activity around Futenma has increased. And given the fact that Futenma is located right in the middle of a densely populated urban area, the risk of some kind of horrible accident happening is quite great. And so there's a question about what to do until the completion of the Futenma Replacement Facility. Another problem is the discovery of a soft seabed, what geologists refer to as mayonnaise. And the Japanese government recognizes this problem, and they've decided that they need to alter the construction plans. And one of the alterations is to put in over 70,000 piles that are necessary to stabilize the soft seabed. And a lot of structural engineers argue that even with this, the runway would not be totally stable, and this would require relatively frequent repairs of the runway. And then on top of that, the high cost of this project. So if you're a defense hawk, you would want to know, what do I get for spending $22 billion or more on the Futenma Replacement Facility? And my answer is that what you get is a highly vulnerable military facility, which, if it was hit by a Chinese missile attack, unlike Kadena, it would be very difficult to repair. And then finally, even if the Futenma Replacement Facility is built, the U.S. Marine Corps has publicly acknowledged that this would not meet the operational requirements for a high-intensity conflict. So my conclusion is that despite the defeat by Okinawa Prefecture in the recent legal battles, from a military rationality point of view, the current Futenma Replacement Facility idea needs to be re-examined, needs to be rethought, and a better alternative should be developed. And I have my own personal ideas on what that alternative could be. But since I'm pretty much out of time, I think I will stop here and leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mochizuki. That was very informative, and we look forward again to discussing these issues as we move on here. So now I'm going to pose some questions to you, and we can discuss them. I won't specify who should answer them. I'll just leave that up to you. First question. Dr. Mochizuki has made a very good case of why the bases in Okinawa could be moved, many of them could be moved to the mainland, Kyushu, maybe to Sasebo or some of the other existing bases. And we know that public opinion, even on the mainland, is in favor of moving bases out of Okinawa, getting rid of this gross disproportionate burden that they carry. So my question is, Japan is a sovereign country. Why can't they respond to this and move to equalize the burden?
Well, I'll take an initial crack at this. So in the abstract, I think as the public opinion polls that Dr. Hateruma referred to, there's a feeling that there has to be a greater equalization of the burden. So in the abstract, I think many Japanese on the main islands feel that way. But then when it comes to their own backyard, their own locality, then there's reluctance. Now, some of this is already beginning to happen, but unfortunately, because of some of the recent mishaps and tragic incidents involving the MV-22 Osprey, I think there's even greater reluctance, and if not opposition, by communities, like around Saga or elsewhere, to accept the Osprey aircraft. And that's the key thing, when we're talking about Futenma, is where to put the Osprey aircraft, and whether you need to have 24 permanently deployed in Okinawa. I don't think so, but that's just kind of one reason why it's been very difficult. And in terms of, it's not so much moving bases, but using existing bases to take some of the forces from Okinawa to elsewhere. And I think the core of the problem is the U.S. Marine Corps presence.
Well, speaking of Ospreys, that brings up another question. Again, Japan is a sovereign country. They, for a while, they were resisting the resumption of those flights, but now they've started again. Why can't Japan just say no? We don't want Osprey flying in our airspace. The end.
Yeah. Well, I often refer to this as a syndrome. It's the fear of American abandonment syndrome. And it's this view in the Japanese policy community that Japan is dependent upon the United States for security. And if Japan says no to the United States on issues like this, then the United States might actually abandon Japan. And I call it a syndrome because I think it's a false psychology. With the rise of China, if the United States wants to pursue strategic competition with China, it needs Japan more than ever before. So if Japan were to, it's not so much to say no, but to say, we're for the U.S.-Japan alliance, but we favor a different kind of force posture. The United States is not going to say, oh, well, if that's the case, if you're not listening to us, then you're on your own, we're leaving. But I think it's a psychological problem of dependence in Japan. And then the experience of the Hatoyama government. I mean, Prime Minister Hatoyama was brave in challenging the initial plan, but the amount of kind of pressure that was brought to bear on him and his government by the United States, and the pressure that was supported by the Liberal Democratic Party against Hatoyama was intense, so that in the end, he had to back down. I don't think he needed to back down. I believe that he made a fundamental mistake in backing down. I don't think there would have been a crisis in U.S.-Japan relations if he had told President Obama, we're great allies. Let's work together to come up with a better solution to the problem of the U.S. military bases and the unfair burden that the Okinawans have to bear for hosting the U.S. military presence.
Dr. Hateruma, would you like to add to this discussion? We can't hear you. Can't.
Okay. For the first question, why not other parts of Japan not try to receive the U.S. bases instead of Okinawa? I think what Mochizuki Sensei pointed out was right, but I would add some more points. And there's civic group. There's a little movement in civil society that tries to invite U.S. troops from Okinawa to mainland Japan. It's a very still tiny movement, but it's scattered around Japan, all over Japan. So if they have, gain more power or more influence into the, local politics or, national politics, that may change the situation maybe. But one of the hurdles for them that they would face is the kind of sort of understanding of the U.S. Marine Corps' unity or continuity, I would say. So there's a belief that the Marine Corps aviation units or other elements should be located close to each other. So Okinawa is a perfect place to be stationed. So if these parts are scattered around Japan, that will be decrease of Marine Corps efficiency, or it affects Marine Corps' operational capabilities. So there's maybe, I don't know, misunderstanding or misperception of the Marine Corps operational capabilities, but there's a deeper kind of belief of the such issue. So I'll stop here. So could you?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on something you said in your presentation, that there are Okinawa hate groups on the mainland, that there's anti-Okinawan hostility. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think there's a kind of like tendency that is attacking the Okinawa government or the local newspapers, saying like they are wrong and Okinawa is not listening to Japan. Okinawa is not Japan anymore. These kind of bashing and hate speeches actually, and the local newspaper journalists protesting tries to fighting against these speeches, but it creates sort of like firm group of people who don't listen to Okinawans' voices, just follow the national explanations and stuff like that.
So these people believe that Okinawa has no business protesting the presence of military bases, that they should go along with the program.
Yes, because these base issues supposed to be national issue, which is that the government should take care. So there's no space or no responsibility for the Okinawan, the local governments or local people to be involved. And I know the number should be small, being loud in the SNS or, but they're loud.
Well, moving on then, Dr. Mochizuki has outlined all these great plans for reorganization of the Marines and all these acronyms for these new concepts and everything. But there are 18,000 Marines in Okinawa, comprises by far the largest contingent of the 30,000, approximately 30,000 U.S. forces who are there. But according to some research I've read, actually, there are only 2,000 Marines in one unit, the Expeditionary Marine Unit, that are actually capable of rapid deployment in a crisis. So the other 16,000 Marines are just kind of doing routine training there. We had a symposium that Dr. Mochizuki will remember a couple of years ago, and we invited former Secretary of Defense William Perry. He was Secretary of Defense under Obama. Actually, no, it was under it was under Clinton, I think, before that. But he said that we asked him, why don't most of the Marines train in the United States? They'd be better off there. They speak the language. They wouldn't be going around causing all this trouble. They'd be happier. And his answer was they could. And so I keep wondering, why doesn't this happen? Why do the Marines insist on maintaining this huge presence in Okinawa? Are there financial reasons for it? Is the Marine Corps afraid that maybe somehow they're going to be diminished in the hierarchy of services allocations? So I guess maybe we should start out with Dr. Mochizuki on this one.
Well, first, there is a certain defense of the organization. So the fear is that if the Marines were to leave Okinawa and go back to the continent of the United States, would this mean basically that the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, which is one of the 3 divisions, would be dismantled? So there's one division in North Carolina, the other division in California, Camp Pendleton, and then the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force is headquartered in Okinawa. So if they were to move back, then the question is, does this mean a drastic reduction in the Marine Corps? But I see that given the organizational transformation going on, one could make a case that there's a mission for the Marine Corps, and it doesn't mean that a major departure from Okinawa is going to mean a dramatic downsizing in the Marine Corps. And even under Force Design 2030, General Berger has talked about a shrinkage in the size of the Marine Corps. I also agree that a lot of the training can be and should be done outside of Okinawa, and some of that is already taking place. And this is why you have the rotational deployments in Australia. And so I think it's quite possible, theoretically, to just have a Marine Littoral Regiment deployed in Okinawa with about 2,000, some logistical capability, and a part of the aviation group, and maybe the command, and then the rest of the forces could be moved, and some of this will happen with the creation of a Marine Littoral Regiment in Guam. But the big question is, what kind of air facility does the Marine Corps need? And even if it's only the smaller 2,000 force unit, the Marine Corps insists that the transport capabilities need to be close by on Okinawa. But my counter argument is, given the long range of the Osprey transport aircraft, it is not necessary to have all 24 be permanently deployed in Okinawa. You could at least cut it by half, and some of the other transport aircraft could be deployed elsewhere, like in Kyushu. And if that's the case, then all you would need to do is to have a heliport rather than a full-scale airfield at Camp Schwab. And so you can stop the rest of the landfill project and just use what has been filled already and downsize the facility. And that would be, I think, a compromise that would make a lot of sense. But I think there's this bureaucratic inertia that prevents either side from changing the plan, and this requires, therefore, political will at the highest levels of the U.S. and Japanese government. But right now, there isn't that political will.
Right. This is a question, another kind of general question, and it's probably aimed more at people on the mainland than in Okinawa. There's been a lot of talk about preparing for this Taiwan contingency. Of course, Okinawans are worried because they don't want another war. The last war they had, a quarter of their population was killed. Aren't there people on the mainland who worry that all of this buildup in the Western islands is more likely to provoke a war than to prevent one? Maybe Dr. Hateruma can address that to begin with.
Okay, sure. I think I have no, statistics or, some data to prove my opinion, but this is, I would say there's not much people see it's a provocation to deploy, SDF in the Nansei Shoto, the Southwest Islands. It's more for the deterrence. And I think because most of the people, most of the people in Japan, Okinawa is also a distant place. Taiwan is much farther. And so it's not really their own business. It seems like it's not their own business. So it's, something happening in a far area. So that's why I think they don't feel any fear of, being attacked or being targeted by deploying these forces at front.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would kind of add 2 points. I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding of deterrence theory in Japan, and I don't fault the Japanese public for this, because deterrence theory can be pretty esoteric. But I really fault the security experts in Japan. And one of the architects of modern deterrence theory is the late Thomas Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he wrote 2 fundamentally important books, one called The Strategy of Conflict and the other Arms and Influence. And he argued quite persuasively that in order for deterrence to work, you also need to have policies of assurance for the possible adversary that their core interests would be respected. And unfortunately, the current direction of U.S. policy regarding Taiwan and China, and unfortunately Japan is just kind of signed on to this, is that military deterrence, just military deterrence, is what will keep the peace, and not much on the reassurance side. And so some of the things that are being done now by the United States are quite provocative. I mean, there are now reports that U.S. Special Forces have been deployed to the offshore islands off of mainland China to train Taiwanese forces. And this, definitely gets into the red zone, or even crosses a red line for the Chinese. And so it's highly provocative, but because of the inadequate understanding of deterrence theory among many so-called security experts in Japan, they basically don't see the provocative aspect. The other reason is that there is this fantasy that if there is a conflict over Taiwan, it will just be Okinawa that would take the hit. And certainly Okinawa would be a target of Chinese missile attacks. But in war games that I participated in, if China decides that it is going to strike U.S. military bases in Japan, it's not just going to be at Futenma or Kadena, but they would also strike Sasebo, Iwakuni. I've been in some war games in which China would strike Yokota Air Force Base. And so the entire Japanese archipelago is at risk. It's not just Okinawa, but there is some mythology, some fantasy among many people in Japan that if there is a war with China over Taiwan, it will be kind of limited to Okinawa, and the rest of Japan is relatively safe. And so this is why they turn to Okinawa and say, well, we're sorry, but your tragedy is basically that you're located in a strategic area. But again, it's a misunderstanding of the strategic situation.
Any further comment from Dr. Hateruma on this, or?
Yes, I could think of a recent news reporting that the Japanese government tries to expand the civilian access to the civilian ports all over Japan, not only Okinawa.
Right.
So I wanted to see how the Japanese citizens to react those expanding military roles all over Japan.
Right, and this is one of the challenges of the agile combat employment of the U.S. Air Force. And so the U.S. Air Force wants to disperse its air capabilities throughout the Japanese archipelago. And the idea is to give China more targets. And so, if you have civilian facilities accepting U.S. Aircraft, then they could conceivably be targets. And so, for me, the only solution to this is through dialogue and diplomacy and reassurance. And there's not enough investment and energy devoted to diplomacy in order to reduce tensions. It's been so much focused just on military deterrence. And Governor Tamaki understands this. And this is why he's been promoting the notion of regional diplomacy. And the regional diplomacy is a kind of a local government like Okinawa reaching out to regional actors. But it's also regional diplomacy in the sense of trying to come to some kind of understanding and promoting dialogue among possible adversaries. And so Governor Tamaki and some of the civil society organizations have reached out to experts from mainland China and also to Taiwan. And the idea is that through dialogue and diplomacy, perhaps there's a way of easing tensions.
In addition, there's a lot of economic activity between China and Okinawa, and between Taiwan and Okinawa. There are thousands of tourists from both places come to Okinawa. Now the signs in the hotels when I was there during the American occupation, used to be in English. Now they're in Chinese. People go there and buy souvenirs, they shop, they eat at restaurants, they love drinking awamori. So it's more diplomatic activity and economic activity too. I mean, war is bad for business, so the more that it seems to me, the more that there can be activity in the economic sphere, the less likely there is of a conflict. We've been discussing this among ourselves for a while, and I think it's been very informative. But maybe we should try to open this up to other participants in the webinar, if that's possible technologically, and get some direct questions from them. Is that possible, Kristen?
Yes, there are questions that were submitted before the webinar registration, and I think I sent that list earlier, but I can pull it up again. And then we also have about 11 statements or questions in the Q&A function. So I can read those, however you would like to proceed.
Yeah, let's hear the Q&A questions.
Sure. This question is from Alan, who I believe is at Georgetown. Says Mighty Osan Air Base in South Korea is located much closer to Taiwan than another massive base located in Tokyo, Japan. The United States Forces Japan's Yokota Air Base. Therefore, should there be more cooperation between South Korea and Okinawa? I'll let, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, well, I certainly believe that there should be more kind of dialogue and cooperation between Okinawa and kind of all regional countries and societies, and certainly South Korea shares common interests with Okinawa, but also with Japan to reduce the risk of war. I mean, although I fear that a high-intensity conflict in East Asia could expand into a much more global conflict, initially it is going to be in East Asia. And so for Americans, that's a war across the Pacific. But for Koreans, for the people of Taiwan, for the people of China, for the people of the Philippines and elsewhere, this is a conflict in their neighborhood. And therefore, they have a huge stake. And so rather than being so fixated on the problem of U.S. abandonment, they should focus much more on the danger of entrapment because of the intensification of U.S. China competition. And unfortunately, what we're now moving towards is a divided Asia with, on the one hand, you have the United States and its alliance system, and then on the other side, China, Russia, and North Korea. And the deeper that this division becomes, the greater the risk of military conflict.
Kristen, could you read another question?
Sure. This question comes from Jinshiro Motoyama. I'm happy to join this event today. My question is, how will the next U.S. presidential election affect the Okinawa base issues? Thank you.
Well, I often joke with my students that if I had 5 minutes with Donald Trump, I could convince him that the current military deployment in Okinawa does not make military sense, especially the construction of the Futenma Replacement Facility. I mean, if you just think in terms of a businessman, it just makes no sense. But what I worry about Donald Trump is his volatility and the fact that he's so unpredictable. And this happened in the case of North Korea policy, that I think there was a real concern that Donald Trump could have started a military conflict on the Korean Peninsula. But then he shifted into, I think, a good stance of summit diplomacy with North Korea. So the big concern I have is the volatility. And therefore, if Trump is elected president, and I hope that doesn't happen, it would be very bad for the United States. It then means that Japan, countries like South Korea, the countries of ASEAN, that they need to work together, and I would include Australia and New Zealand, work together to create, what I call a middle power coalition, to have leverage on the great powers, the United States and China, to mitigate their strategic competition, what Kevin Rudd calls to create the guardrails in the U.S.-China relationship so that it does not spin out of control into a military conflict.
Speaking of Trump, he did threaten to take US forces out of Japan if Japan didn't contribute more money to their support. And Taoka Shunji, who is the military affairs columnist for the Asahi Shimbun, wrote an essay which I translated and put on into a journal that said, fine, let them leave. Japan can defend itself. We don't need US forces. US forces are just using Japan for their own purposes. I don't know if you read that or not, Dr. Mochizuki, but I'm sure you know about him. How would you respond to that?
Yes. So in fact, I read that piece, and I don't think even under Trump administration that he would follow through on such a policy. The national security establishment is so strong that there would be major resistance to pulling forces out. I mean, all forces, the 7th Fleet, the U.S. Air Force, kind of basically ripping up the U.S.-Japan security treaty. I just don't see that as happening. And if the United States were to leave, then the United States would cease to be able to pursue a global military strategy. And Trump wants to make America great again, and I just can't imagine him following through on that threat.
I don't know. Is it a good thing for the United States to continue pursuing a global military strategy? Maybe there are problems with that too. Well, okay. So, Kristen, is there another question?
We have
about 10 minutes, I guess.
Yeah, we have several, and I don't know if we'll be able to get to them all, but I did want to get to Leonardo Fontes at the University of Sao Paulo. Japan has recently volunteered into joining the US and coming to Taiwan's aid in case of a Chinese invasion. Back in the Vietnam War, there was a large uproar in both Okinawa and mainland Japan due to fears of them being pulled into a foreign conflict. Are the Japanese that much more invested in current conflict than they were with previous US involvement in East Asia and Southeast Asia?
I can give an initial answer to that. First of all, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding. The Japanese government has stated that it has an interest in the peace and security of the Taiwan Strait, and it favors a peaceful kind of resolution of this issue. The Japanese government has never stated that Japan would come to the defense of Taiwan. Now, there have been some politicians, like former Prime Minister Aso, who has made some remarks, but Japan has been quite restrained and cautious about sticking its neck out in terms of direct defense of Taiwan. But if Japan were to be attacked in a Taiwan contingency by China, then I think Japan will do whatever it can to defend itself. Now, the big question is whether Japan will allow the United States to use its military assets, not only in Okinawa, but the rest of Japan, to intervene in a Taiwan contingency. And here, this will be the most difficult decision for a Japanese government. And that decision will really depend on the concrete scenario about how we've reached a crisis so that China would launch some kind of military operation against Taiwan. But it would be a misunderstanding to think that the Japanese have committed itself to the defense of Taiwan. And unfortunately, there are people in Taiwan that think that Japan is more likely to intervene than the United States. And so I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of where Japanese preferences are regarding the Taiwan contingency.
Well, Kristen, this is up to you. Should we go on with this, or is it time for us to wrap it up?
I'm going to ask two more quick questions, I think.
Good.
And then we'll wrap up after that. An anonymous attendee said, thank you so much for your great presentations. I have a question for Professor Hateruma. Why do you think there is a stronger fear of rising China in Okinawa than it is in mainland Japan? Thank you.
So this is simply a geographical proximity, because it's too close geographically, and if the contingency occurs around Taiwan or in Taiwan, the sea lanes communication will be disrupted to Okinawa, or so it would affect the sea lanes. It would affect the lifelines of Okinawa. So because the islands of Okinawa depends on sources coming out from Okinawa, so it really affects severely to Okinawa.
Okay, and then one last question. This is from Jeremy Hicks at Oklahoma State University. What kind of economic and social consequences would we see in Okinawa and the mainland, assuming that the Marines reduced or removed its military presence in Okinawa?
Okay, so Okinawa has a great successful case of using the land that was former U.S. bases. There was commercial facilities, housing, and schools, and it created a lot of incomes, revenues, work, these labor opportunities. So compared to the base land used for bases, the land used for these civilian purposes would create more, economic activities and these benefits for the local community and economy.
Two that I can remember when I was stationed there in the 1960s. Hamby Field was a helicopter training base, and it also was the headquarters of the K-9 contingent, where they trained the dogs, many of whom were sent to Vietnam. But the other one is the American Village, which used to be a part of a military base, and now there are these thriving shopping centers with bars and restaurants. And I mean, to me that's kind of amusing, but maybe it has some importance too.
Right, I lied. There's one more question I'd like to pose from the audience, because I think it's a good one, and then we'll conclude after this. Anonymous attendee says, thank you so much for the great presentation. I have a question for Professor Mochizuki. As you pointed out, the result of $22 billion or more might be a highly vulnerable military facility. This is referring to Henoko. What does the U.S. say about this result? Are they okay with having a highly vulnerable military facility from a military rationality point of view and a political point of view? Thank you.
Well, if U.S. taxpayers had to pay for this facility, to pay the $22 billion, I can assure you that the United States would not support the plan. But the cost for building this facility is being borne by Japan. And so the thing that I find very hard to understand is, why do Japanese citizens actually tolerate this kind of massive misuse of money? So if you are really concerned about Japan's security, then this amount of money could probably be spent on other things, which will be much more meaningful for the defense of Japan. So again, I don't know who I would blame, but it's the kind of the lack of a critical perspective regarding current policies regarding Okinawa.
All right. Well, Dr. Rapson, did you want to wrap up the discussion portion, and then I'll do some concluding remarks?
Really, it's hard to sum things up, but I think maybe what Dr. Mochizuki just said about there being misapprehensions, misunderstandings among policymakers and among the general public, I think is much to blame for what Okinawa is bearing in the way of this disproportionate burden. The word security always bothers me. I mean, it's a tricky word. I mean, you can talk about security. When I was in Okinawa during the Vietnam War, supposedly we were fighting there for the security of Southeast Asia. And there was a domino theory that if Southeast Asia fell, the next would be Korea, and then Thailand, and then eventually Japan. These massive miscalculations on the part of our policymakers, which caused the deaths of not only millions of people in other countries with these catastrophic interventions, but tens of thousands of Americans. You know, I just wish that there was more critical view of the implications of these policies in Japan and in the United States.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rapson, for your concluding remarks, kind of pulling everything together for this evening. So this does conclude our webinar this evening. I'd like to once again extend my warm thanks to both panelists, Dr. Mochizuki and Dr. Hateruma, as well as Dr. Rapson for a wonderful discussion. And also a thank you to everybody who joined us this evening. The Okinawa Prefectural Government DC Office will continue to hold events like this. So please feel free to send us your comments or suggestions. We post basic information about Okinawa, recent developments, event announcements, and the like on our website. So please check back from time to time. The address is dc-office.org. A recording of this webinar and our other webinars will be available on that website as well. So this concludes our webinar for this evening, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.